My full name is Lora, spelling L-O-R-A, Tobias. (1929). I was born in a little town about 8 to 9 kilometers north of Heidelberg in Germany. Then the 30 Years' War ended, and people started to, this was in the 1630s, and people who had been driven out of villages that were predominantly Catholic or Protestant, and among those people who were driven out during the 30 Years' War were the Jews, and they wandered about. And in 1642, my first ancestor came there and asked for permission to stay in Schriesheim. And he said yes, he could stay there as long as he paid the Jew tax, which was fairly exorbitant. But he stayed there. His name was Baruch. It is not in the record what his name was, not Baruch ben somebody or Baruch or whatever. And he had a wife whose name was Hefela, and they had 4 sons. And all of this is from research done by a scholar there. I grew up in Schriesheim, and of course did my mother and my grandfather, whom I knew, of course. After that, I did not know them, but the Oppenheimers, after Napoleon conquered that part of Germany, and Jews in Germany were entitled to citizenship like any French citizen. And that was about the early 1800s. So Napoleon not only, he liberated the Jews because they had the same rights of man as every French citizen did. And that, my ancestors started to prosper. They were allowed to own property. They were allowed to own a house. They were allowed to go into business. So Napoleon was the liberator of the Jews in Germany. And by that time, I had a couple of ancestors who had already lived there, and they did very well. There were not many Jews in Schliessheim. At one point in the late 1800s, there were like 125 Jews in this town of maybe 2,000, maybe less. And when I was born, the people, the Jews left. They went to bigger cities. They emigrated to America. And when I was born, there were maybe 36 Jews left in the village. We still had a building that passed for a synagogue. Various things. I mean, my first ancestor, he, among other things, he was a butcher, where he slaughtered animals to be consumed by Jewish families in the Jewish way. So he was a shochet. He was also a peddler. He did numerous things. He was a moneylender. And they did very well. I mean, at least from what I have from this it was this paper, this scholastic paper that Dr. Brum did. And then as the years developed, the men started dealing in tobacco, because this was a tobacco area, and you had a tobacco exchange, or Börse, in Mannheim. But before then, I would bring matzah in to show to my fellow classmates. It was fine. And I entered first grade in the local public school. I was well accepted. I had a nice teacher. I learned how to read and write, and in those years, the German, when you wrote, was a different drive. It wasn't print. It was like a different kind of cursive writing. And and I did well, and then the Nuremberg laws were passed, and that was in 1935. And that's when everything started to change almost overnight. I got a teacher in second grade who was an ardent Nazi supporter. And he decided, I mean, I was one of 2 Jewish children in the school, and he decided he was going to make an example of me to the class, and this is how we treat Jews. I had to sit in the back of the room, not just in the back of the room, but I was surrounded by empty desks. He called me names, and he kept saying that this is how you treat Jews who are no good. And I had to do my homework and hand it in to him and my classwork, and he took these papers and carefully held them between his thumb and forefinger, and then he ripped them up and threw them in the garbage pail. Again, an example. This is what you do with dirty Jews, or whatever names he called me. Recess time was a horror for me. When I came into the yard, he encouraged the other children to abuse me, call me names, and pick up little stones and throw them at me. And there had one refuge in the safety place in the schoolyard. There was a lady there selling cookies, and I hid behind her, and she protected me, and she told the other hooligans, "Get away." And that is how I survived recess time. I ran out of the schoolyard and into the Catholic Church, and the children were afraid to pursue me into the Catholic Church because they knew they were not supposed to be in there. Strict laws against what Jews were allowed to do or not do. People, physicians, and lawyers and all of this were stripped of their means to earn a livelihood. I was not allowed to go to school. You could not go to the university. You could not live in certain towns. I mean, the whole idea was to get rid of the Jews, to get them out of Germany. And if anybody got papers to leave Germany, oh, there was no problem getting an exit visa. But it was, people were, it was publicized, and I mean, we were not allowed to go into stores. We wanted to go to a grocery store. Well, we couldn't go buy groceries there. And again, among the Nuremberg laws, Jews could not hire any domestic help who was under 45 years of age. So we had this woman who had been with my mother since 1928, who helped bring me up, and she had to leave us because she was in her 30s. And of course, she was the breadwinner for her family, but she found another job, but she had to leave us. Again, Nuremberg laws, can't hire Aryans. And of course, there were the laws against Jews marrying non-Jews, and those marriages were considered illegitimate. Every morning in kindergarten, we all said a prayer for Hitler, and that God should bless him, and that he was the savior of our country, and we owe allegiance to Hitler, not to our parents. Our first devotion and attention and allegiance was to this man called Hitler, whom I had no idea who he was. But like everybody else and all the other children, I said the prayer for the safety and for the well-being and whatever for Hitler. And at night, when I went to bed, and I always said a Hebrew prayer, and among the Hebrew prayer, I also added the prayer that I had been taught in kindergarten, but God keeping Hitler safe and prosperous. And of course my parents were shocked, and they said, "Don't you ever say that again." And at least, but in kindergarten I had to. Everybody else was saying it. I had no idea, but this is what all the other children were doing. And of course, pretty soon, nobody would want to play with me.
Right.
And I was isolated. And the only person I had who would do anything with me was my uncle, who lived with us. As a child, he had a spinal meningitis or something else, and he was handicapped. And he was the only one who protected me when I came out of the Catholic Church, brought me across the street in the wintertime, took me sledding, and it was interesting. Now, even though he his name was Ludwig. He was my mother's oldest brother, the oldest child in the Oppenheimer family. In the village, you had many families who had family members who were handicapped. And everyone knew that he wasn't quite right in his head, that he was slow, but he could read and write, and somehow or other, he was accepted in the village because so many of the other German families had members who were handicapped in one form or another. In my family, when I was born, the family had shrunk. My mother and my father, my grandfather, who was in his 70s then, Ludwig, and then a sister of my deceased grandmother, who was deaf and dumb, and she lived with us until she passed. I couldn't go to school. And in Heidelberg, there was a private school, just a private school, and they rented space so a Jewish school could be created. And this Jewish school then rented rooms from this private school, and we had staggered classes, so children from the various villages who had to go to school but couldn't go to public school. So I went there until 1938. In the meantime, in 1936, my mother had a brother and my uncle, and then he was married in 36, and he got an affidavit and a visa to come to the United States. So he came to us in 1936, he came to New York, and he realized we had to get out of Germany. He realized what was happening. But who was going to give us an affidavit? And it took a while. He got my aunt out in 1937. He found some distant relatives. And then we got the affidavits. And then we had to go to the U.S. consul or consulate to get a visa. And my grandfather, who was 80, got it. My mother and my father got it. I got it. But my uncle, who was handicapped, the U.S. government refused to give him a visa, even though he had an affidavit, and we had to leave him behind. And I remember saying, and we didn't know what to do. All our possessions were packed up to go on a freighter to the United States. We had ship's ticket to go on a German liner to come to the United States, but we had to leave Ludwig behind. And I remember that was probably the saddest day of my life, when I had to say goodbye to Ludwig. And all the mail was censored by either the Germans or the Americans, so you had to be very careful what you wrote. And we left Ludwig behind, and at that time there was still a Jewish home, or old age home, or nursing home, and we had to leave Ludwig behind. And of course, he never understood why we were leaving him. And it was very confusing, very heartbreaking for all of us. And then we left Germany in September of 1938. Little did we know then that Hitler had invaded Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia. And the European countries supposedly had a treaty with the Czech and the Sudetenland that if they were invaded by a foreign country, England and France would go to war. And then we got the affidavits, and then we had to go to the U.S. consul or consulate to get a visa. And my grandfather, who was 80, got it. My mother and my father got it. I got it. But my uncle, who was handicapped, the U.S. government refused to give him a visa, even though he had an affidavit, and we had to leave him behind. And I remember saying, and we didn't know what to do. All our possessions were packed up to go on a freighter to the United States. We had ship's ticket to go on a German liner to come to the United States, but we had to leave Ludwig behind. And I remember that was probably the saddest day of my life, when I had to say goodbye to Ludwig. And all the mail was censored by either the Germans or the Americans, so you had to be very careful what you wrote. And we left Ludwig behind, and at that time there was still a Jewish home, or old age home, or nursing home, and we had to leave Ludwig behind. And of course, he never understood why we were leaving him. And it was very confusing, very heartbreaking for all of us. And then we left Germany in September of 1938. Little did we know then that Hitler had invaded Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia. And the European countries supposedly had a treaty with the Czech and the Sudetenland that if they were invaded by a foreign country, England and France would go to war. And Hitler promised that, no, I am not going to invade any more countries, you're fine, I will abide by the treaty, that I will not grab territory from other countries. And then that was September 27th, 28th. And at that time we were already aboard ship, and we had left Germany. And then when this conference took place, and we was a German liner, and they were afraid that war would break out. And then Chamberlain left Munich, and his famous words were, "I have achieved peace in our time." And then the ship was allowed to sail, and we left Germany. And one of the last things I saw in Germany, we went to see my father's mother in another little town, and she blessed us and gave my father a prayer book. And as the train left Mannheim or Heidelberg or wherever we were, and she was on the station and waved goodbye to us with my father's sister. And that was the last time we saw her, because she perished in the Holocaust. And then we made it. I mean, we were safe. Nobody. I mean, we were a huge family. My grandfather had cousins. They all perished. They were taken to a concentration camp in southern France called Gurs, G-U-R-S. It's on the Spanish border. And the Spanish government, when they had the civil war with Franco and others, asked the French to build a concentration camp where they could imprison Spanish citizens who were against Franco. And this is where they rounded up Jews who were all left. They were sent to Gurs. My grandmother and my aunt had family living in Holland, and they left to go to Holland. All of them were rounded up and sent to Sobibor on a cattle train. But I had two cousins who were hidden by fundamentalist Christians and were saved. And I had another cousin on my father's side who was in the concentration camp where my Uncle Ludwig ended up, and he buried him in the concentration camp. And he made his way afoot across into Switzerland. So of all the family we had, and there were many of us, only 3 young people survived. Well, it was 1938, and my uncle said, we're going to get a house at the beach in the Rockaways. And we're going to rent out rooms in the summertime. And we had all this furniture and stuff coming from Germany so we could furnish the house. And we were in Bell Harbor. We had to register as enemy aliens when the war broke out. The FBI came in the middle of the night to investigate us. This was in Lancaster. And brave child that I was, I always slept with a cap gun under my pillow. And when then suddenly the light turns on, I don't know, was it 11 o'clock, was it 1 o'clock, and these two strange men walk into my room, and I reached under my pillow and I pulled out my gun and I said, stick 'em up. So we never had any for years. So that's why I don't even have my mother contacted family in the United States, but they managed to get us out, give us an affidavit, get us ship passage, and all of this with writing letters which were censored. Yes, I went to school. Well, when we moved to New York in 1944, my father got a job back with the man he used to work for as a leaf tobacco expert, and we came back to New York. And I went to high school in New York, and eventually went to City College, graduated from City College, and that is where I met my husband, because he at that time was working, he was attending City College. Yes, I have 2 daughters and 2 grandchildren. I mean, my mother had rekindled her friendship with some of her friends, and she went back there a couple of times because she wanted to go to the Jewish cemetery where her mother was buried. And then I wanted to give money to the town to take care of the cemetery and take care of the graves, and they said, no need, we don't want your money, because the town pays for the upkeep of the Jewish cemetery the same way it takes care of the other the Christian cemetery. It was back with mixed feelings. You know, it was so many years later. What had happened to me was in the past. I knew people I would avoid, and it's interesting. We were not there anymore, but we were not forgotten. And so those stripping stones are in front of our old house, and it has my mother and my father, my grandfather who made it to the United States, my uncle who perished in the concentration camp in Gurs, and a 5th one, me. And I thought, what am I doing there? I'm still very much alive to tell my story. His story is very different. They lived in Berlin, and in 1938, after Kristallnacht, his father decided they had to get out of Germany, and that the only way to get out is going to try to get smuggled into Belgium and then bring the family over. Well, he was caught by the Belgian police and was turned over to the Germans, and he ended up in Dachau. The only way in those days, in 1938, you could get out of Dachau is if you had a ship's passage to go out of Germany, to exit Germany. The only place on earth that would accept Jews without affidavits or visa or anything was the Japanese-occupied part of Shanghai. At that time, Shanghai was a tripartite city, the French section, the English section, and then the section that had been Chinese, now occupied by the Japanese. So his 6th mother found out about this, went to Dachau. She booked passage for 6th father or her husband on a freighter to go to Shanghai. So 6 said he had 48 hours in which to leave Germany. He came home. 6 said he had lost a lot of weight, his head was shaved, but his mother packed him up and brought him on the ship to go to Shanghai. And then because there was no visa requirement or no quota or anything. And then his mother managed to book passage to join them in Shanghai. So they left to go to Shanghai to join his father. And he grew up in Shanghai. He spent, 5, 6 years, 7 years attending the Mirror Yeshiva, which was supposedly a very elite and very intellectual yeshiva that had made its way to Shanghai, through Russia, through Japan, and Manchuria into Shanghai. They were just forced to live in a certain part of Shanghai, and if they wanted to leave, they needed permission from a man in charge called a Mr. Goya. But it was not walled or anything. It was just open.
Okay.
But, everybody knew
That's
you
right.
weren't Chinese or Japanese, you were European.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently the Japanese treated the French and the English badly, but they left the Jews alone. So they had peddlers, they had group homes. Large families lived in one room. It was very hard, but they survived, and there was no threat of being shot because you were Jewish. And then when the war ended, they found out what had happened from a German Jewish newspaper called the Aufbau, means rebuilding, and then they found out what happened, that all of their relatives in Poland had been killed or sent to concentration camps. And I said, and eventually, he finished high school and entered City College, working part-time. His parents came from Shanghai. And then he had one aunt who had survived the war, because when she was in Poland and Hitler was approaching Poland, she packed her family up and they went east, and they survived the war in Siberia.
Mm.
And then and then when the war was over, they made their way back to Germany and came here to the States. Displaced persons were allowed to come in, and there was a congressman named Seller who passed a law saying displaced persons, no matter where from, have entry permission to come to the United States. He wrote a lot of articles, and the book that I have, the Shanghai Ghetto, that's his memoir. But he always said, yeah, but I had 150 publications in professional journals, plus the fact that he gave numerous speeches in his area in educational psychology, and he taught at City College for many years. And 2 weeks later, we would have been married for 68 years. So we were married 67 years, with a lot of wonderful memories. I'm 94 years old. I've lived a long life, and then had a good time, did many things, traveled a lot, was curious. Before I went to college, I think I educated myself by reading a lot. And now I'm ready for my next move. I'm working on it. Dan said he would edit it. I don't know what skills he has, but I have a lot of chapters. What I did, when I taught, I would take the children to the Jewish Museum. And then I tried to let them know, and I said, well, I tried to make them realize what happened. I said, just imagine if suddenly you woke up one morning and there was not a soul left alive. This is what happened when all the millions of people were killed. I also try to emphasize, you should not judge somebody by their race, by their color, by anything. You have to take people as they are. Not You've got to get rid of these preconceived ideas. Because you're white, you're better than somebody who's black. Forget it. We're all equal. We're all human beings. And you should get rid of those prejudices. And that's what happened to the Jews, because the Germans thought Jews were inferior and wanted to get rid of them. And said, you've got to accept people as they are. We don't want something like that to happen again. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism is on the rise again in this country. And I don't know, I mean, with what's going on politically, with the Proud Boys and the others, and who are raising the specter of the Jews are responsible for what's happening. We got to get rid of them. And what's happened, where the synagogue in Pittsburgh was, they were attacked. I want the hatred that people have for one another to end.